Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Today we're going to talk about a historical event, so not so much the law, but I've mentioned the Italian Hall disaster before, and that's where somebody ran into a crowded theater on Christmas Eve 1913, yelled fire to cause a panic, and 73 people died trying to get out of the building. And the Italian Hall disaster was national news at the time, but it kind of fell by the wayside. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about it called 1913 Massacre, but other than that, most people have never heard of the event unless you're from Michigan. Even then, probably not. So it happened, like I said, 1913. But to this day, I still hear from people who say, well, but it happened because the doors opened the wrong way. The doors opened the wrong way. And what's weird is that we know for a fact that the doors opened the correct way. The doors opened out towards the street, and people who passed through them could just push their way out through the doors. The doors had nothing to do with the disaster. And yet, people still tell me, they say, well, the doors opened the wrong way. What do you expect? And the problem with that is that if the doors in fact opened the wrong way in 1913, it would mean the building had been built not to the correct building code, and the fault lay with the idiots who put the doors on backwards, as opposed to putting the fault at the feet of the right person, which is the man who yelled fire when there was no fire. And so this is a weird divide in the community, but people in Calumet to this day still tell me, oh, the doors opened the wrong way. And I've spoken to other people who just have heard the story and they, yeah, I always heard that the doors opened the wrong way. It's a myth that needs to die. It's like an urban legend. So it's bizarre, but it needs to be addressed. And like I said, it's because if you believe the doors are the problem, that's different than there's actually a bad guy who is the problem. So I wrote my book about the Italian Hall disaster, and it came out, I think, in '06. And, I covered a lot of ground in that book, not just the doors. In fact, I touched on the doors, but didn't dwell on them because I thought, well, something, I'm going to lay out the case for the doors and then move on to other stuff. And even after my book came out, people would still come up to me and say, well, Steve, but the doors opened the wrong way. And I can tell you right now, I've given presentations with PowerPoints and slides, and I put a photograph of the doors on the screen. It's the same photograph I used in the cover of the book. And I found this photograph in a private collection. It hadn't been published in 95 years when I found it. And it clearly shows the doors opening the correct way. And after I give my presentation, a guy in the front row raises his hand. He goes, yeah, but the door's open the wrong way. And I'm like, I keep thinking that people are punking me, but they believe this to be true. And I don't know why, but they believe it to be true. So here's the funny thing about this is that after my book came out, I was contacted by somebody in Lansing. And they said, Steve, at the end of your book, you mentioned that the doors opened outward. And you mentioned that the historical marker on the site says that the doors opened the wrong way. And I said, yeah, the marker's wrong. And the woman said, well, those markers are owned by the state of Michigan. And I said, okay. And she said, we don't like there to be mistakes on our markers. And I said, okay. And she goes, can you document for me that the doors, in fact, opened the correct way? And I said, yeah, why? And she goes, because we'll fix the marker. I said, really? She goes, yeah, we'll fix the marker. I said, okay. So I put together a report and I sent it to her. And I laid out the case for the doors opening the correct way. And the letter I sent her is addressed dated July 21st, 2008. But, I'm enclosing documentation which supports the position in my book that the doors to the Italian Hall did not open inwards. And then I laid this all out. And the letter here is only 3 or 4 pages long, but there's like 35 or 40 pages of attachments. You'll just have to trust me that the attachments exist. So, for instance, I pointed out that the Calumet News, which is the local newspaper, in 1908, the year the Italian Hall was built, actually ran an article describing this brand new beautiful building and said that the building is going to be built with doors all opening outward. And you might say, Steve, why would they, did they anticipate something? Like, why would they do that? Well, you have to remember that the reason doors open out has nothing to do with the Italian Hall. It predates the Italian Hall to a disaster in Chicago called the Iroquois Theater. At the Iroquois Theater, something like 600 people died in a building that caught on fire. And people couldn't get out because the doors opened the wrong way. And this is, I interviewed architects for my book. And they said that was the inspiration for putting, panic hardware on doors and making all doors open outward in like theaters and stuff. The Italian Hall it has a theater in it. So they mentioned the outward opening doors as a nod to the new building codes that had come about because of the Iroquois Theater. But then there's other facts. That's just one of many facts. So, for instance, I pointed out that the photographs, which I had found, which were taken the morning after the disaster, clearly show both sets of doors opening out towards the street. And the funny thing is, we know the photographs were taken on Christmas morning, 1913, literally 16, 17 hours after the event had taken place. William Nara set up a big camera and took 2 photographs of the front doors. And I've shown those to people, and they say, well, those weren't taken Christmas Day. I'm like, no, we know they were. That's not in dispute. And they say, oh, well, then the doors were replaced overnight. You can see the doors aren't new doors; they're old doors. And besides, there's no evidence to suggest any of that's true. Okay, the doors open the correct way, and they open out, and the photographs clearly show it. But then there's more. That's just 2 things. I got more. Trust me. So the coroner held an inquest to try to determine why these 73 people died. And the coroner's actual job is simply to determine a cause of death. Was it an accident? Was it a homicide? Was it a suicide? And they fill out death certificates. And the coroner had a 3-day inquest where they called something like 70 witnesses. And not a single witness mentioned the doors as a contributing factor. Now you might say, well, that's Steve, because, oversight? Well, no, there's actually a problem because the coroner was on the side of mine management, and I don't mean to get into politics here, but he was doing his best to protect the mines, and the rumor was that the man who yelled fire was doing that at the behest of the mines because the children were all the children of striking miners, and this was a union issue. And so he was doing everything he could to protect mine management. If the doors could have been blamed, he would have blamed them. But it didn't even occur to them to blame the doors because nobody mentions it. So although the word doors pops up many, many times, nobody ever says, by the way, the doors were stuck or shut or anything of that nature. None of the contemporaneous newspaper coverage in the Calumet News, the Daily Mining Gazette, or others ever mentioned the doors in any of their coverage. And certainly they would have. There's actually a mention in a local newspaper that says this phrase: upon the cry of fire, little children by the hundreds and women attempted to pile out into the hallway and down the stairs to the narrow exit, the doors of which opened outward. Okay? So even in the contemporaneous newspaper coverage, the doors opened outward. There's no question. And again, I don't think the newspapers would get that wrong if that was the contributing factor. Okay? Now, here's the thing. I did this story, and I was laying out the facts in chronological order. I'd have to come back to one fact. But like, for instance, there's a woman named Ella Reeve Bloor who wrote a book called We Are Many. She was a labor organizer. And she wrote her book in 1940. And she says that the doors were held shut. In fact, that's the position that Woody Guthrie adopted in the song 1913 Massacre. But the weird thing is that the only reason you have to hold doors shut from the outside is if they opened out. So the doors weren't held shut, but that's not the point. Angus Murdoch, in a book called Boom Copper, does not mention the doors at all. And his book came out in 1943, 30 years after the event. And by the way, his book has now gone through 13 printings, and they never changed that reference to the door. No reference regarding the doors. I have photographs in my book looking down the staircase that show how close the door frames were to the bottom stair. And the door frame for the doors close to the stairs were so close that if the doors had swung in, they couldn't be opened. They had to swing out. So the 2 sets of doors, the outer ones swing out, the inner ones swing out. I also mentioned that there are a lot of places the doors would have been mentioned if they'd been a problem, but no one ever mentioned them. So for instance, the logbook from the Red Jacket Fire Department describes going to the scene and what they found there. No mention of the doors. The death certificates for the victims contains a space for the coroner to fill in the cause of death, and all of them simply said killed in a jam at Italian Hall, caused through an alarm of fire. But never does he say because the doors opened the wrong way. And the coroner's actual verdict also doesn't mention the doors. And the other thing is that there were several investigations, not just the coroner, but the Washington, D.C. sent up some investigators. And in their investigation, not only did they take testimony that no one mentioned the doors in, but they also went to the Italian Hall and measured things. They counted how many steps there were, how wide the steps were, how big the vestibule was, and never once mentioned which way the doors swung. If the doors had swung in an unusual fashion, they would have included it. So that's another major problem. And I like to point out that when the building got demolished in 1984, the doors still opened outward, exactly as they did in the photographs from 1913. So the question I always had is when did all of this start? In other words, if it happened in 1913 and no one mentions the doors, no one mentions the doors, when did it start that somebody mentioned the doors and said, oh, the doors opened the wrong way? Because someone's got to start a story, right? And we've talked about urban legends before. Who starts an urban legend? And the interesting thing is that I actually went back through all of the literature and I believe I found the actual first mention in print of the doors opening the wrong way. And the earliest reference I could find was a book called Red Metal by a man named C. Harry Benedict. And C. Harry Benedict wrote his book in 1952, 39 years after the tragedy. And the interesting thing is that he was an employee of the mine and he worked for management. So he was on the side of the people who wanted this thing to be a disaster, but not anybody's fault. And he writes a whole chapter about the strike, but he only writes one paragraph that mentions the Italian Hall. And he simply states, the outside door, unfortunately, opened inwards. And that's the quote. The outside door, unfortunately, opened inwards. Amazingly, the outside doors are obviously always opening outward in every photograph you can find of it. It was the inner doors that most people claimed opened the wrong way. So the funny thing is that where he got it from, we don't know. Whether he believed it was true, again, we don't know. But we do know that he was a management type who was writing a book that was very, very favorable to the mine. In fact, I've got a copy of it. I've read the book, and it's obvious this guy worked at Calumet and Hecla, the biggest mine in the area, where many of the striking workers had worked before the strike. And he was writing a book that was glowing with praise about Calumet and Hecla. And oh, by the way, there's a strike and a bunch of people died, but it's because of the doors. So whether he started that or not, I don't know. But he then put it into print, and then it took on a life of its own. One of the most amazing things about the story is if you go back and read the contemporaneous reports, that is the reports that happened soonest after the event. And for instance, firemen, guys who showed up to help with a disaster. Somebody called in a fire alarm from the local firebox, and the fire department's only a block and a half away, and the volunteer fire department shows up very, very quickly, but there's no fire. But they did help untangle the mess in the stairs and pull bodies out and carry bodies over to the village hall where they're setting up a temporary morgue. And several of the firemen were asked about what happened, what did you see? And you can also find these kinds of statements in the local papers right around the time of the disaster. And among the descriptions that people had of the event, you get a bunch of people, including some very well-known people, who said that when the commotion or whatever the trouble was at the Italian Hall, when it first started, there was so much commotion and noise that everyone knew something was happening over there, but nobody knew what. So people ran over to the hall, and there were 3 ways that you could get into the hall. One is through the front door and up the stairs. On the side of the building, there was a little alleyway, not very well lit or marked, and there was a fire escape, but it was the kind of fire escape that you had to pull down to go up, or if you're coming down, the weight of the people on the stairs would push the stairway down. So if you were a fireman, you'd know about that fire escape on the side of the building. And then around back was a ladder, at least 1 ladder, possibly 2, attached to the back of the building. And so presumably you could climb up that ladder and get into the building, or people were climbing down, which is more likely what was happening most of the time on that ladder. But among the people who showed up were firemen and other people who later told the press that they got there, they opened the doors up, and here are all the people on the stairs, all jumbled and crushing down with the weight of the people behind them, but they couldn't help them because there's so much weight pressing down on them. But they could see them and even talk to them. And there was, and I forgot which guy it was, but there's a guy who was quoted in the paper saying, I spoke to people in the pile saying, hang in there, we're getting help, help is coming, help is coming. But the point is that if the doors opened the wrong way and there's all this weight pushing against the doors, holding them shut, then how did people walk up the building, open the doors, and talk to these people? Okay, that doesn't make any sense. The other strange thing is if you go through all the testimony and all the different people talking about what happened there, There's actually testimony of people who said they were standing near the top of the stairs inside the building. It's a two-story building. And when the cry of fire went up inside the hall, they bolted down the stairs, out through the front doors, and into the street. And the interesting thing is that the first few people who ran down the stairs and out in the street actually got out and never mentioned the doors opening the wrong way or stopping to open the doors inward or anything like that. And the interesting thing is that at least one of them said that they turned around and were waiting for other people to come out, and people weren't coming. And they weren't coming because what happened was somebody fell near the top of the stairs and pushed or shoved or fell or whatever, and then other people from behind were pushing, and pretty soon you have people tumbling and falling down the stairs. And the stairs from top to bottom was a 14-foot rise, which would not meet modern building codes, but it did then. And so all it takes is one or two people to fall on the stairs, and next thing you know, there's a pile of people on the stairs. And also, and this has a lot to do with how the building is laid out, but to get to the top of the stairs, you had to turn a blind corner. So if people were pushing, the second somebody falls on the stairs, the people pushing wouldn't know it. They'd probably keep pushing. And on top of all that, inside the building, the children to adult ratio is about 5 or 10 to 1, meaning that for every adult, there's 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe 10 children of varying sizes. So you take a few hundred people like that, overwhelmingly children, stick them in a small room, or stick them in a room over here, and then have them all try to exit through one set of doors onto a landing and then down a steep flight of stairs. And like I said, the left-hand turn, there's a blind corner, and you have a jam up on the stairs, and people are caught in place. So 73 people did die, but they did not die because of the doors. The doors had nothing to do with it. The people who died didn't make it to the doors. They died on the staircase. So it's kind of strange we have to argue about something like that. But the good news is that after I sent my report to Lansing, they agreed with me that the historical marker needs to be changed. And they actually let me write the language on a historical marker. So the new marker is in place. It simply doesn't mention the doors. We don't mention the doors one way or the other because the doors had nothing to do with it. So my hope is that years from now, people will stop repeating the wives' tale. Oh, I heard the doors did it. Doors opened the wrong way. No, they didn't. The doors had nothing to do with it. And if you don't believe me, go look at the marker. So that's the story about the Italian Hall doors. And I hope you enjoyed it. Questions or comments? Put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.